Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, I believe, wherever you're joining us from, depending on the time zone you are. My name is Akinola from the DJ Connect team, and we are excited to host this interesting session on supply chain power room series, looking at how value network enable autonomous supply chain planning and execution. This is being hosted with our presenting partner, EdgeValve, an Infosys company, and we will be having an interactive session today. Before we start, I would just want to go through a quick housekeeping note. Depending on where you are, please know that you're free to put up your cameras. It's always great to have that engagement in this virtual environment. Also note that, as you have noticed, all participants are muted. Of course, our speakers have been given the access to unmute themselves. So this is to avoid background noises and, of course, to have decorum and let everyone focus on the session. Also, we depend so much heavily on networks these days. So depending on how strong your network is, sometimes it might drop out of the network. Please note you can rejoin back using the same link, and we will be happy to admit you back into the session. And last but not the least, we would like to make this as very interactive as possible. Please, throughout the session, feel free to put in your questions in the chat box, and I will be able to present them to the speakers for them to respond accordingly. Today's session, we do have a very simple agenda. We have a keynote session. I'll be inviting Praveen just now for about 15 minutes, and after that we have an interactive session with Geeta moderating, helping to facilitate that conversation between George and then Praveen as well. So this will be the simple program we have for today. So please stay tuned and enjoy the session. Also introducing our speakers, Geeta Pacharu is the Principal Product Client Solutions for EdgeValve. George Lowry is the Vice President and Principal Analyst for Forrester Research. And of course, Praveen Kumbel is the Global Head of Sale for EdgeValve. At this stage, I would like to invite Praveen for his session. Kindly note that Praveen is the Global Head Sales at EdgeValve, an Infosys company. Praveen's mandate is to leverage product and platform built leveraging process automation, artificial intelligence, as well as emerging technologies to solve business problems for industries globally. Hi, Praveen. Thanks for joining us today. It's great to have you. And please, over to you.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Akinola. Just to confirm, you can hear me well enough?
Yes, loud and clear.
Lovely. Yeah, and thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And, lovely to have my co-panelists in Geeta and George. So what I'm going to do is maybe take the next, 10 to 12 minutes to just kind of walk through some of our thinking in the supply chain space, because that's obviously the focus area. And what do we mean here by our value networks and the whole story thereof. Again, just to confirm, you can see my screens, please?
Yes, the screen is live. Please go ahead.
Thank you. All right, so we're talking about value networks and how do they enable autonomous supply chain planning and execution. Seems a bit like quite a lot to achieve, but really before you go there, if you take a step back at some of the key trends that all of you have been seeing and experiencing globally, is that we've seen a product explosion, and particularly as you try to reach out to individual customers, more and more products have hit the market. Interestingly, while we saw a shrinking of some retail outlets, actually the demand points have only increased, and that's because they've also got fragmented over a period of time. Through COVID, particularly, we've seen at least 75% of the organizations that have reported supply chain disruptions, meaningful disruptions. And of course, the big flip has been that almost 60% of global consumers have pivoted to e-commerce, and that's been a mega trend out there, right? However, there has also been many challenges, and many of them are things that we've been experiencing for a while. Of course, our ability to drive meaningful forecast accuracy, and having visibility of our supply chains has had kind of improved in between, but now continues to be a challenge back again because of the fragmentation and the move to e-commerce. And we're still relying too much on kind of shipment-based data to kind of forecast what we're going to expect to sell. We do still spend, particularly CPG organizations, are spending tremendous amounts of money on promotions, and the effectiveness thereof is still a little unknown. There continues to be limited market coverage, outlet coverage in the emerging markets, and that's particularly true. And as we were looking at many of you who are joining this discussion, we realized that the markets of Middle East and Africa, particularly, were very well reflected in the audience today. And you're clearly seeing that as a challenge. You've clearly walked through many import and export challenges and supply chain disruptions in the Middle East and Africa markets. And that's obviously reflected in the kind of limited coverage that you might have in the emerging economies in general, right? And of course, products out of stock situations have only gone up dramatically. We've also seen a challenge in supplier identification discovery as you've typically gone through these disruptions. And while the initial thinking was about driving some untapped procurement savings, it's now become more about resilience, which means that many organizations have made a trade-off between supplier resilience and availability as against more a cost-saving opportunity. And of course, traceability challenges continue, right? I was looking at some stats from the region, and there were some interesting data points. And for example, the flower industry exports from Africa have been tremendously impacted. But there's also been some interesting patterns, right? A lot of rubber being exported from Africa, going out to China to create PPE toolkits that come back to Europe and then find their way back as finished goods into Africa. And this circular challenge has led to obviously disruption, but many organizations are now looking at saying, okay, how can I shorten and diversify my supplier base, right? We've seen many such patterns emerge in the Middle East markets as well, particularly as you've looked at managing your food security and diversifying your supplier base thereof, right? So clearly, some global mega trends, some regional trends, and obviously challenges, many of them accentuated by COVID as a scenario, but also seen a big shift in consumer buying behavior, particularly as you go online. However, our value chains are not necessarily as nimble. And the traditional chains, as we set up many years ago, and continue to be so globally, have been complex, have been tied, very rigid, many information silos, and that leads to lack of transparency, increased cost, and lost opportunities, etc. And of course, just that whole shift to online has led to a fragmentation of demand. Really, to our minds, the need of the hour is a value chain that is not as rigid, that is not as linear, but that allows for more opportunities. And I think someone put it very well that says, really the explosive growth in online commerce and the adoption of this online commerce has been very seamless. In fact, the emerging markets have taken to it even faster, right? And that's because they just gave one generation jump to the technology. So really the online, the explosive growth of online commerce and new product introductions, the demand signals have become highly fragmented. And now the supply chain challenge of positioning inventory at the right place to make the most of your value opportunities has become even more acute. And now you add to the fact that you're also looking at supplier diversity and those challenges, it really is a big one to solve. So what are we doing at Edgeworth to solve for this? And what we're saying is that we believe that the market is now ripe and ready to adopt to a network. And the network is really, at the simplest form, is really about bringing your supply chain parties onto one common transaction experience layer. And who are the parties? And obviously, the manufacturers, the warehouses, the retail channels, the distributors, the logistics providers, the financiers sometimes, all of them essentially form a part of the network. Are we connected today? Yes, we are, because that's how we transact and that's how we get our supply chain to work and to fulfill all of that. But like I explained before, they're fairly rigid. And having the ability to connect in a many-to-many non-hierarchical network way is what we believe is the value network of the future. The ability to connect, the ability to collaborate, the ability to transact, the ability to have visibility in a many-to-many peer-to-peer kind of environment is what the future is about. And we have technology today that allows enterprises to do that. They could be the center of the hub. And it's not just a planning department that's trying to bring this visibility together, but technology affords for all of these partners to be connected meaningfully together. But what are you connecting for, right? You're essentially connecting to drive some sort of a process flow. And there could be a number of process flows that you drive. It's about consumer order flows. So you have online orders, they've got to be orchestrated, they got to be traced for fulfillment, and your consumer gets the final order, the final good. There are B2B flows in your intra-party systems or your suppliers or your retailers, which is understanding demand signals, forecasting better, again, orchestrating orders and replenishment. There are material flows on the supply side, which is about having better inventory visibility, and not just to your direct suppliers, but your echelon suppliers, N-1, N-2, and again, to be able to forecast and orchestrate orders and track and trace and have the inventory at the right place, right? All of this at Edgeworth is a huge digital agenda for us that we have in our markets today and many customers, which is all about bringing this ecosystem together to address these process flows on one common unified platform that is connecting as an experience layer to those underlying systems of record, to your underlying ERPs, warehouse systems, or even far more unstructured data inputs like what your retailers might send or what your warehouses might have available, or just what your partners are able to send as signals. To be able to bring this whole data into one common ecosystem and drive this orchestration and process flows is what our value network is about. And we drive a number of use cases through that, which is about visibility, fulfillment, orchestration, and we're using a lot of digital data technologies, machine learning technologies to help drive these use cases. We're helping data get to a better shape. We're helping drive suggestions, forecasts, orders, and to be able to drive it in a meaningful way across all your partners in the ecosystem. And this is not about having one global network. This is actually about having many, many small mini networks in your regions, in your sales regions, in your country level, and then trying to keep connecting the dots at a global level as well. Very short, and this is going to be, we want to talk through a number of examples as we go by. George has worked on so many of these, and we'll refer to some of them. But if you take a step back and saying, what does this journey look like? How do we start? Where do we start? And those are some of the burning questions. And we kind of built a framework over a period of time and how to go about this. And we'll talk through some of those as examples. But there's no perfect way to start. There's no perfect deep data available. You got to start at a mini level, at a use case level. You build an integration layer to bring your partners onto a common ecosystem. And this is about getting data at very low latency and high granularity at the earliest. You've got to have interoperability, which means that not everybody is producing this data at the right standard, right? So having some sort of conversion of these data standards, but also to saying that, how do I simplify the data? How do I use machine learning to make it relevant? A retailer is not using the CPG's, product hierarchy. How do we bring a lot of that data together and at scale to be able to transfer that to the CPG's hierarchy so that that data makes sense is what interoperability is about. It is also about driving collaboration and orchestration, right? How do you bring your suppliers together onto one common forum? What will be the drivers to collaborate? How will you give them better demand visibility? And how do you orchestrate processes? We think of it like a circular loop when you get some of this base into play. The value delivered is immense. As many of you would appreciate, the ability to unlock value out of this in visibility, sheer visibility itself is such a big lift from where you are to drive better case fill rates, reduce out of stock scenarios, and just drive a lot of savings in the whole value chain ecosystem, and more fundamentally improve the resilience, as we have all learned the importance of it in the last 12-18 months. So this is a big agenda at Edgeworth, and we take a lot of this with our global clients to the market. We would love to talk more about it, and Akinova, I'm handing it back to you for the next one.
Thank you very much, Praveen, for that quick intro, and thanks for those insights. I know we'll be delving more into it during the panel discussion. At this stage, I would like to invite back once again Gita Patru to help us lead the conversation. Hi, Gita.
Thank you. Thanks, Akinola. And hello, everybody. I welcome you to listen into a short panel discussion with two esteemed panelists that we have today here. And I'd like to start by introducing George Laurie to you. George is, he has about 2 decades of experience in the space of supply chain. He has experience in deploying global ERP applications in complex multinational organizations. He is currently a VP and a principal analyst with Forrester. And during his tenure in Forrester, about 14 years now, he has been leading research in various areas. And prior to Forrester, he has spent time in consulting and has been a supply chain practitioner himself. Welcome to the discussion, George. Happy to have you here today.
Thank you.
And the second panelist we have is Praveen Kumbial. He is from the Edgeworth organization and is responsible for global sales for the Edge products. In his responsibility, he is also deeply involved in developing and taking supply chain product portfolio to the market. Welcome, Praveen, to the discussion as well.
Thank you, Gita.
We did hear you speak, Praveen, in your keynote about the disruption that the pandemic has caused, and definitely, as we all have experienced it in our personal lives, it has created, and we do see the impact on the supply chain itself. So how do you think, George, this question I'd like you to take is, how do you think supply chain as a function is evolving, and what should be the key focus areas that the supply chain should adapt to these unpredictable business scenarios, one being the pandemic?
Great, thank you very much for the question. And I think Praveen actually put his finger on it when he said people have been using shipments to drive their forecast. And I have this actually quite a lot with my clients who often say, well, now I've got these strange sales data because perhaps we didn't have anything, we didn't sell anything. How am I going to adjust my forecast? Now that tells me that they're using historical data, SKU store shipments or something of that nature, or SKU store sales, perhaps to drive their forecast. And what we've seen people doing really is saying that just doesn't work in a more volatile environment. You've got to include some leading indicators. And again, I think Praveen mentioned this idea. We've seen people in all kinds of industries try and learn from the white goods industry, from automobiles. Those folks, they include things like forecasts about interest rates, forecasts about take-home wages. Actually, during the COVID crisis, one of the people I was working with, they were using the R coefficient that was published by Johns Hopkins, and they publish it by state, by county, and they were using that to try and figure out, will the suppliers I normally use, will I be able to use them? And that brings me to the second piece. So the first bit about resiliency is you need to be having a more sophisticated forecast, which of course means more signals and needs some sophistication around the machine learning and AI you use to interpret them. But the second piece really is around, I'd say, protecting your bottlenecks. Every supply chain has a bottleneck. And quite often, because we've specialized so much, we might have only a single supplier of something. When you look deep down inside systems, there's always an alternate bill of materials and an alternate recipe, some alternate suppliers. But people don't use them. They forgot all about them in this case. And so what I have seen people doing is using these kind of leading indicators to go, wait a minute, maybe that supplier won't be able to supply us. Maybe they're going to be in lockdown. How do I switch to an alternate? And this is where really a supply network helps, where you've already got pre-validated and let's say, authenticated suppliers that you can switch to. I found hardly anybody able to do that during the crisis. I think the next time something like this happens, they'll be ready and they'll know how to do that, and they'll have a kind of incident room that sent them this warning and says, quick, we need to swap over and order from someone else. Maybe even syndicate our requirement and see who else can do it from the whole network. Sorry, that was a long answer, but those are the things that I think about and worry about.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Praveen, how would you like to add to this? I mean, especially how do you think multi-enterprise value networks help in transforming the supply chain and to deliver the value or more value that we're looking for?
Yeah, no, thanks, Geeta, thanks, George. Yeah, so I think George put it so aptly, right? This is about signals and having to our minds the ecosystem on a common technology or a common data view is the first way and means of getting that signal. And you could do various things with the signal, right? So you could find bottlenecks, you could look for alternate partners, you could reprioritize your shipments. There's some fascinating stories, right? I mean, one of our CPG customers, George, and like you were mentioning, we're using COVID data during the peak of the pandemic to try and prioritize which stores are still going to be online, and then to be able to reduce the out-of-stock scenarios in those stores particularly, and we're redirecting shipments from elsewhere to get to that point, right? So it really comes down to saying, I want to get a better sense and varied sources of data to look at my signals, and that's what the kind of value network really helps drive. And it's about speed. It's about doing it real time, near real time, and so on and so forth. The other thing to my mind that has emerged is that people are now, when they're online, their experience expectations have gone up tremendously, which means what? Their patience levels on fulfillment have gone down significantly. You want your shoe, you want your dress, you want everything day after tomorrow, and no later than that, right? So hence the other trend of saying, I need to understand the patterns of behavior and buying in a way that I can accelerate that fulfillment signal, and hence sometimes follow.
Yeah, I think Praveen's facing some technical challenge there. Praveen, can you hear us?
I think I'll go on with George. While,
Sure. Yeah, okay. So we'll carry on with the discussion and let Praveen join us back. George, oh, here you are, Praveen.
Yeah, sorry about that. I saw Akinola mentioning signals at the start. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes,
you're
I can.
now.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just talking about how, those signals help really get more information from the value network to help drive, either resilience, better fulfillment strategies, really better end consumer offtakes. And those are some of the value drivers as well. Geeta?
Right, yes, thank you, Praveen. And that was a brief disruption, and talking of disruption. All right, so we were talking
Signal failure.
A network failure.
All right, talking about disruptions and the signaling especially. Nowadays, it is important to have visibility to all of this, right, for organizations to be able to act on things. So George, we do see that a lot of organizations lack that visibility beyond, say, tier 1 suppliers that they are, working with. What do you think are the implications of that, and what advice would you give to such enterprises?
Yeah, so a couple of things here. I've recently been working with someone in aerospace, and they said, yeah, we really understand our tier 1 suppliers. We have very little idea what's going on further down. and they have something like 29 different levels in the expanded bill of materials. There's an awful lot of embedded software there. They're really nervous about that. Where did the software come from? Who was involved in it? So they spend a lot of time trying to authenticate all these sources of supply and trying to, first of all, understand and inspect them and to know, do we trust them and how do we trust them? But more broadly around visibility, I think people far down the supply chain, they have a lot of concern about what's happening with the demand signal. In the old days, particularly, I'd say in repetitive manufacturing, so automotive and some types of other manufacturing, the OEM would just publish a schedule and say, right, we're going to call these off and you better put these assemblies on our site. Well, that's terribly worrying to people down there because they actually carry all the risk. If the forecast is wrong, then what happens? So I had one who was working with an OEM who told them, here's going to be the split between SUVs and compact vehicles, and please put all the drivetrains where we can assemble them. And if we don't use them, just hold them there. By the way, they're on your balance sheet. You can imagine how worrying that is. So there's a ton of waste around all this. But there's also quite a lot of concern, I would say, for, I'd say the end consumers. So I had one company that makes baking materials, and they buy in vanilla essence. They said, look, we know that the end consumers, they really care about how that vanilla was grown. They care about the condition of the workers. How can we trace this? How can we have some kind of certification that says these vanilla pods and this essence? And you can imagine this is it's an ingredient that they buy that's already been assembled. So there's a long chain that they have to investigate. But for them, there was very high value behind it. So that visibility, and essentially you need a network where you understand and know who these people are, where you perhaps inspect them or somebody inspects them that you trust, and then you can link that trust to the items that you're selling, and that drives value for people at the other end. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. It's all about building the trust down to the end consumer, and that matters, and that's primary. Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, George. Praveen, again, staying on the topic of visibility itself, how do enterprises start getting that visibility, considering they have different levels of technology maturity, given the systems that they might already be using?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem, Geeta. It's not yet solved for everywhere, right? So many organizations went down the path of creating these mini networks through EDIs and building those deep connections. The problem with that is that it's the scalability which is the challenge, right? I mean, to really get meaningful parts of your network on, whether it's on the supply side or demand side, would take you ages. What we must understand, and particularly it's true in the emerging markets, right, is that the technology maturity of your partners is not going to be at the same level. So if you sit on a high horse and saying, you know what, I want it this way, and I'm the API economy guy and so on and so forth, that's not going to work. We have to have the ability that technology drives that interoperability. And so what we've been doing is that we've been using a lot of AI and machine learning and digital technologies to, first of all, bring a lot of this data together. At last count, we were bringing about 5 million retail touch points from across the globe. And as you would expect, many of that is in the emerging markets. And we're getting data points from people who send it on a daily, weekly, SKU level, store level, with crazy calendar differences, frequencies, formats, and so on and so forth. And we're using the technology to cleanse, classify, make sense of it, and bring it to a product hierarchy master for about 22 odd CPG customers. That heavy lifting is what you need to do to be able to really get that data in a form that can be used somewhere by planners to help drive that demand signal, which is more than just shipment data, right? So that's where I see technology playing a part. We can't be waiting for everybody to mature. We've got to drive that maturity and use technology to drive that maturity. And it's getting more complex, like Josh was saying. I mean, it's not just about the POS data, it's not just about sales data. but you need to look at very different alternate sources of data. Here's a story of one of our customers in Africa, right? They're trying to bring this demand visibility together across 23 countries. And it's as fragmented, saying, I've got WAN sales and some data coming out of those sale touch points and mobile sale, handheld sales touch points that really have to be consolidated to drive that meaningful demand visibility, such that I can change my replenishment strategy on a daily basis if need be, right? So that's the kind of granularity and depth that you need to have to get technology to do some of the heavy lifting to manage the lack of consistency of maturity of your partners in the ecosystem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's first, I think the key lies in also being able to capture all that information from all of those different sources. And that's, as you said, where technology plays a key role, providing that visibility that we're after, right? Another aspect to all of the supply chain is also, of course, about demand planning, right? And demand planning, it varies by industry. A CPG company might plan a slightly different way when compared to somebody in a fashion or pharma industry. What are your thoughts on this? And I'd let both of you go for it. George and Praveen, just share your thoughts, please.
Well, I think, when you have a long lead time and inelastic supply, and think about the semiconductor shortage that we have now, or think about seasonal fashion, you really need to use all the data that you've got in order to make the best bets that you can. Inevitably, there's some kind of betting that goes on here. And of course, you can use other strategies. You use postponement options, and you can use in-season expediting. And Praveen just talked about the idea of maybe expediting some purchase orders, so you could certainly do that. I've seen people use two-speed supply chains quite a lot in this to kind of mitigate the worst impact of demand uncertainty. So they might have, let's say, if we think about apparel, for the things that they really know what the demand is going to be, it doesn't matter if their safety stock is, taking 13 weeks to come on a ship from Vietnam. They know what it's going to be, but the weird colors, the mystery plaids, the odd sizes, they might have some kind of onshore for that. And we've seen companies that do very high fashion apply really sophisticated AI, not to the sales, but to the interactions that people have with their website. So they might just put out a handful of items, not even all the sizes, not all the colors, but it's an avant-garde item. They know when people are going on the website, what are their responses to that? And that drives what they call the rebuy, drives what they're going to do. And they do that normally onshore or nearshore, so they can do it really quickly and responsively. And that's a great example of a kind of two-speed supply chain and applying AI to solving this problem.
Right. Praveen, do you want to add to that?
That's a very interesting one. I like that description, George, a two-speed supply chain. I think in another way, it's kind of also been a bit of a wake-up call to that, the concept that we were talking about here, which is a trade-off, right? So the planner is the one who's really making the trade-off between cost and now resiliency
Yes.
at the risk of taking some additional costs in the near term. I think the GCC went through that, right? A lot of goods, final goods being imported has led to serious long-term disruptions, which has actually led the council to go back in the Middle East and saying that, I want to look at ways and means of encouraging local manufacturing, which is akin to what you were saying. It's kind of a two-speed supply chain, which I need to definitely get closer. That's obviously impacting the P&L in the short run. But that's a better stage to be in, as against the fact that you're completely out of stock on key elements. So that's an interesting one.
We've seen regulators talking about that, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, saying, yeah, okay, it's all right to source, an ingredient from elsewhere, but you won't get your recertification unless you can assure us that you're going to be able to maintain continuity of supply, which you can imagine for some kind of medication would be very important. But we saw the same thing actually a little bit around the chips, that people are using options there. And I think HP's famous for this. It's done it for years, to say, we can't commit to this manufacturing, but we'd like to place these options in case this thing really takes off. And the people who were smart around the chip shortage, they already had some options in place. Anyway.
Great. So it's as if, like you say, right, it is the consumer who is dictating how the others plan what needs to be done across the supply chain, right? Whether it's a manufacturer or a planner or any other role throughout the supply chain. Talking of consumers here, as we also heard Praveen talk about it earlier, there is a shift in the way consumers have been buying. And we saw that major shift during the pandemic. Most consumers have shifted to online shopping and brand websites and distribution systems. Some of them have found a challenge in actually fulfilling those orders because of the limitations in their e-commerce platforms, right? And they're not ready to fulfill individual customer demands. So how do you see this paradigm shift where brands are moving more to direct-to-consumer models and be able to cater to that sort of a model?
Well, it's interesting because the first thing they have to do is to try and think about what their brand is. Is their brand a brand that has high purchase velocity? Is it one that has a high exclusivity as a cult? So we look at that, and depending on how they fall into that kind of matrix, that depends really on whether they're going to have their own digital channel, or maybe they'll use a marketplace as a third party, a marketplace as a first party. And we've seen different brands experiment with this. So Nike were very early in this. They made big acquisitions in AI. They bought Select in 2019 in order to start understanding how would the data tell them what to do. They started working with Amazon and then they changed their mind. So they reclassified themselves and built their own supply chain. You're exactly right though. It's not just about the e-commerce, it's about how do I build out that supply chain capability? But we're seeing people get more and more sophisticated about this, and we have some tools to help them figure out where they fit and what their strategy might be.
Great. Definitely. And that's how quickly, different companies have started to meet that new model or try and find ways to fulfill that demand, right? And that's really exciting to see how, again, technology supports in making that possible.
It's funny because I did a survey of, in this case, CPG executives. I surveyed 95 CPG executives in 2014, so a really long time ago, before anybody had thought of COVID. And I said, tell me what you think your customer lifetime value is in your best brick and mortar channel, in your own digital channel, in somebody else's digital channel. And they knew that. And they already guessed back then in 2014 that the lifetime value of a customer would be double in their own digital channel, that of the lifetime value of a customer in their best brick and mortar channel. So they already knew that this was coming. And that's not even taking account of all the trade promotions and the money that they spend on pushing stuff through a brick and mortar channel. Why? Because they could get tighter engagement. They could get people on subscription. That's what they really want. They would love you to be on subscription for your running shoes or whatever, and love to be not selling you the shoe, but selling you the running experience and improving your running. It's a bit late for me, I think, but.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And with that sort of, fulfillment and, the model that is shifting towards that, it is also important to then look into the barriers that are there in the linear order fulfillment, that model that is there now, right? So are we looking at peer-to-peer fulfillment, or how then are we opening up in that space? Praveen, what do you think, and how can one unlock this inventory potential using multi-enterprise networks that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so I think to the point earlier that George was making, we've also seen some fascinating trends of how people are trying to get to direct to consumer. For example, there's a confectionery that is trying to use Grab to deliver direct to consumer, right? There's a company in India which is now using some local hyper delivery options to get some of their perishable goods to end consumers. I don't think anybody's worrying about the cost right now, and but these are all experiments that are essentially driving towards saying, what do I need to be ready? I think a key part of that readiness, both to get D2C going, is about inventory visibility. And inventory visibility at a very granular level, right? So in the US, an Amazon would give you like a national forecast for a brand. How good is that if I have to really break that down to 500 warehouses and not be fined for not being able to deliver to those warehouses at the breakdown level, right? So the inventory visibility that is needed to support that granularity is what's going to be the important driver. And again, it comes back to the network. We've got organizations that don't have their finished goods visibility in one place because they are driven by multiple manufacturing capabilities, some of which have been acquired on different ERPs and so on and so forth, right? So just first of all, you're bringing your consistent inventory visibility at a granular level and at a low, at a high frequency level within organizations is what is helping drive this whole D2C. And just look at GCC, right? Again, in the Middle East, I was reading somewhere that there are now at least about 68 e-retailers and aggregators that have come up in recent times, and they're driving meaningful pursuits. So again, look at the fragmentation of the demand, and look at the challenge in having the inventory visibility to support that at a granular level, right? So we believe that kind of a network-wide primary visibility, whether it's for finished goods or for your suppliers, is going to be the biggest driver of having consistency in how you fulfill, particularly as your demand's getting fragmented really heavily on the front end with online commerce and different fulfillment channels. Ida?
Sounds good. I'm just making a note of a few questions. I think I'll be on the chat here. I'd like to take a few of them now, if you're okay with answering them. George, Praveen at the stage.
Only ask me easy ones.
Okay, some of them here. I'm reading out a question where someone's asking about how can one leverage technology to manage supply chain risk effectively?
Yeah, so this is something that, as you can imagine, is a very popular question. There are an awful lot of, I'd say, event feeds that you can subscribe to. They're like RSS feeds. So for example, DHL has one called DHL 360 Resilience, and it tells you which ports are about to get congested, where there's been an earthquake. I'm sure you probably know that, but it feeds it in let's say, an organized way into an event resolution, or they call it sometimes a war room or an event room. And the point is that there's software available that will help you to apply AI to say, what do all these signals mean? What's the sum of these signals? And then to allocate it either to a process to resolve, and it might be the process of invoking the alternate bill of materials or invoking the alternate supplier, or it might be a person, and then it tracks the resolution. So that kind of thing, that kind of risk management is I think it's quite mature, and people are doing it. I mean, they've done it for years around things like the financial stability of their suppliers. So they monitor that all the time. Again, they buy a feed, and when they're looking a bit risky, they might switch to another one, or they might say, can we help you with finance? Or is there something we can do so that you don't drop out and leave us stuck? So yeah, supply chain risks is a big one. The other thing is actually the design of the supply chain to have fewer bottlenecks and to be less complex. That things that we've been spent a lot of people in supply chain are really purchasing people, and their whole incentive has been, actually Praveen already said this, around cost. It's about, let's find the lowest unit cost. We'll design all these hundreds of piece parts. And I remember probably 20 or 30 years ago when I was first implementing a system, I thought, why are there so many industrial fasteners? And why there's so many nuts and bolts and washers? Yeah, because we designed and sent all over the world to make these piece parts, pull them together and assemble them. Lots of people are going, that's a fragile supply chain. Yes, it looks cheap, but it might have been actually less risky and really cheaper and more sustainable in terms of, you know, carbon decarbonization to make this as one thing, and maybe to use additive manufacturing to do it. Sorry, long answer again. Sorry, Ethan.
Oh, well, that answers the question for sure. I'll take the question before we would slightly move to a different topic here. So someone's asking, how did organizations manage the crisis where high stocks due to lack of sales was a problem, and now that sales are up and the problem is the other way around?
Is that one for me?
Well, go for it.
Actually, there are two aspects to this. And one of my colleagues in China, right at the beginning of this, so I can't think when it was, March 2 years ago, I think something like that. I said, you know, what problems have you seen? And he said, actually, you think it's a shortage. He said, because, well, there was no furlough. When people didn't work, they didn't get paid. He said, the next problem is there's no demand. He said, so what you need to understand and need to think about in advance, you need to have these leading indicators. He was the one who really put me onto it. And said these leading indicators are the critical element that says, you know, how should I be running up and running down my inventory? We've been thinking about this a lot, about the balance of just in time and just in case. You probably saw the Wall Street Journal had this screaming sort of headline that said, it's all the fault of Walmart, it's all the fault of just in time, that there's no rice, there's no milk powder and all that kind of thing. Not really. I mean, actually that just in time is why we have the variety of things at the price that we do. But what we might need to do is to have some strategic inventories. So, you know, countries do this. United States has a strategic reserve of tin. Why? Because it doesn't have any tin in the country at all, can't mine it, has to be used somewhere else, but it's vital for all electronics. And I think companies are beginning to do this as well, say, well, what should our strategic reserve be and where should it be? And really, when I used to be a controller in a factory, we had some machines that used to break down. We'd always have some work in process ahead of those machines so we could finish the rest of the work when that old machine broke down. And I think companies are doing this with their supply chains generally.
Yeah, sure. Praveen, do you like to add to that?
Gita, not really to that. I think George covered it pretty well, but I also see another question from Ali that's just popped in, which is really, what's the effective method to mitigate the customer delivery when demand is uncertain and the supplier lead time is high? Yeah, and it's a classic supply chain issue, right? And it's just got compounded. But I think where we are starting to kind of consistently land as enterprises drive this now next transformation agenda, and we're helping many of them traverse that path, is that they're getting far more granular about their demand signals and how they forecast. You know, we're just supporting a customer drive a transformation program to get demand signals for some 48 countries in emerging markets, with there are about 8,000 SKUs, which leads to something like 5 million kind of scenarios which you would need to forecast around, you know, kind of, you know, on a consistent 12-month basis. And some of them have very long lead times in supplies, etc. So they actually want to drive this. And what's their baseline? Their baseline is that they've been doing this on shipment data. And so their accuracy baseline, by the way, is very high, but you're doing it on shipment data, right? When you start pivoting to market data, that accuracy baseline falls to 35–40%. And then you want to bring it up from there, right? So one thing we've clearly seen is that enterprises are clear that they've got to get better at managing the demand signals, getting a better feed for it. On the other side, I believe that this balance between, to get to the right supplier resilience is leading to a better understanding of your suppliers and your supplier cubes and your spend cubes. So looking for alternates, it's not one preferred, let's get a couple of preferreds at least and have that. And I saw a very interesting pattern that, like you said, George, many chip organizations and so on and so forth, they have such fantastic visibility of their multi-tier suppliers, right? Because they've been tracing BOMs, bill of materials across them. I'm seeing more and more organizations globally trying to go down this path of saying, hey, I want to get better inventory visibility on tiered suppliers. So if I take a step back and crystal gaze, I believe these two mega trends of better demand signals and granularity of forecasts and better supplier resilience is really going to solve for this yo-yo. We're not, I mean, hopefully we don't see another COVID and booster doses of the vaccines will be good enough. But I believe that this pattern is here to stay of some sort of disruption or the other. And these two mega trends will solve for that. We're very, very excited about driving some of these transformations for our customers. Sorry, long answer, God says.
Yeah, no, that does answer the question, Praveen, and thank you for that. Before I go on to take the next question from the participants, I just want us to touch on another element in the supply chain, which is the buy side, right? And a request to the participants, please continue to type your questions in the chat window, and I will come back to them after this short, topic here. So yeah, talking about the buy side here, and George, if this question is more to you, is like, what challenges do you see on the buy side of the value chain with respect to supplier collaboration, right? And what is your advice to supply chain professionals to address those challenges?
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about this kind of collaboration. It seems to me that almost my entire life, people would be going, if only we had more collaboration, everything would be fine. But somehow it doesn't really happen. And I remember reading a study not long ago that said even transactional information that they pass backwards and forwards, even that is frequently wrong. And I was just looking at some data about customs declarations. Astonishing how much of that is just basically incomplete or wrong. And this is even when people file it electronically, they just file it incomplete. And I have seen people applying AI to go, wait a minute, let's not even let that go ahead. Why it has to be AI, why it can't just be normal validation, you can't press a button, you can't get past this screen till you fill it in. I don't know. But one of the things that they're doing, or some people are doing anyway, is making some let's say interpretation about what should be in there. I'm slightly worried about that for customs declaration. What might you end up paying because the computer assumed that you meant something other than what you did? But astonishingly, purchase order price is very, very frequently wrong. Actually, in the CPG world, I think we can understand this. Who knows what a single tin of beans or even a case of beans costs, because there are so many off-invoice discounts, so people are confused about that. And I've seen people use collaborative platforms to try and solve that problem. Even more worrying, quite often the item number itself is just wrong. And that shouldn't be, because each GTIN should be unique. But the problem is there are so many variations, particularly look in the CPG world. We have so many line extensions. We have so many promotional variants. Each has a different GTIN. Not too surprising, often that goes wrong. So if it was up to me, I'd spend some time really trying to get those basics right. And can you apply technology to do that? You can, but you also really need to motivate people around it. They need to feel some ownership of it. And I think sometimes they feel it's all a bit remote. And so, yeah, maybe they're not as engaged as they might be in all of this.
Yeah.
Just there's the other, just here, Gita, there's the other part, George, is about what is the incentive for the channel to collaborate?
Yes.
Right?
Yes, absolutely.
I've seen suppliers being worried about too much transparency on inventory positions to saying, oops, I'm going to lose an order. Let me scramble, right? Does it have to be this way? I've seen, demand signals challenging, saying, hey, I want to monetize my data. I'm not going to give it away just like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I want to, make some money out of this, so I'm going to hoard it. But hey, by the way, that impacts your replenishment strategy for your store or your chain, right? So any thoughts that you've seen on any good practices about how to incentivize the channels to collaborate?
Yeah, I think you made a great point there about that sometimes the lack of transparency is people think that is what their value is. What I've seen really is that it's a bit like disarmament. Somebody has to just start. So, but what they have to do is to share the benefit and share the pain around it. So particularly around things like available to promise and capable to promise. Of course, to build a digital twin of a supply chain that we use to simulate what we're going to do with the next COVID or whatever the next crisis might be, well, we've got to expose that kind of stuff. But people further down, they need some kind of reassurance about that. And perhaps the platform itself can provide some control over who sees it. They don't want their competitors to see exactly what capacity they've got or what available to promise, but they might like people who are further up the supply chain to see that. And so I think the network itself can help with that. And I think also it can help with, let's say, this idea of sharing the benefit and sharing the pain. So when in the past, you can remember sales and operations planning, so sometimes we had to reconcile our sales plan with the available inventory or the available space or the available transportation. And somebody had to really sit there and say, I'm sorry, your account isn't going to get it, but this one will. And here's what we're going to do to make it up to you. And I think that's really how this has to work, that there has to be some give and take to make people want to participate. And perhaps it's around, well, what the long-term value of the other partners is to them. And in particular, how the network, we've said this for years, it's not companies that compete, it's supply chains. So it's about how can we be more successful working together and winning more customers at the end of it. And I think that's the thing that actually, I think the network will probably do that more than the supply chain captain. That whole idea of even a chain and a captain, it sounds very hierarchical. And I don't think that really works for the way that people need to evolve now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry about the long answer again, sorry.
Yeah, we did talk so much about collaboration, right? And this is everything across the supply chain and that collaboration. More the supplier, when we talk about it, Praveen, when we talk more about suppliers, we're talking about risk associated with those suppliers and all the aspects related to the performance of that supplier as well, right? How do these aspects, you think, have, maybe can be converted into opportunities in optimizing procurement costs at all?
Yeah, I think, Gita, at this stage, it seems like, procurement costs is not, maybe the optimization is maybe not the biggest agenda right now, if you're particularly trying to balance. But I think people have got better at bringing some of the feats that George was talking about, right? I want to know my suppliers, their financials. I want to know their performance, which, by the way, comes from very different systems. I want to know some events, which, by the way, comes from very different environments, very different sources. And I want to try and triangulate all this together. So it's not so much a cost as it is about a balancing factor, as it is about resiliency, as it is about de-risking, which is the opportunity at hand. And again, technology, AI, ML, driving event-driven risk scenarios that are leading to reviews, which you might do once in a year, now to doing it much more frequently, yes. Saying, am I better covered? That is an experience that we're definitely seeing enterprises go down the path of.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that answer, Praveen. And I just want to take one last question here. We did cover it across the discussion today, but I'll just read it out. It says, how should one plan for the recovery with so many unknowns and additional complexities, which we have been exposed to recently?
Is that one for me?
Go for it, George.
You've been there and done that, man. Yes, yes, sir.
There you go.
Well, I think the thing, my advice would be that, yes, you have to get the basics right, but what you have to do is to, yes, it's more complex now, but what you need to do is to do really what Praveen talked about, is you need to think about your demand signal. I mean, we've always had this bullwhip. The bullwhip's a lot worse now. The demand signal, it needs to be granular. You need to sample it frequently. And you need to manage it across all the channels. So there isn't, such a thing as demand in the store and demand online. That just isn't the thing. It's just demand. Now, where will you allocate it? You need to drive that according to the propensity of people to fulfill. So I think you need to work on the demand side, strangely, before you work on the supply side. And almost all, in my experience, almost all supply problems are actually demand problems when you really look at it. It's because you didn't understand the demand and you didn't do what Amazon does, this anticipatory shipping, which is what the rest of us call, locating inventory down through the echelons so that it's ready in the right place when people want it. And on the supply side, you need to start building this level of trust. So it's about, yes, engaging people at the level of exchanging data accurately, sure about that, but also about sharing insight. So how will we collectively share insight about what is demand for the whole supply chain and what does that mean for you? And by the way, what capacity do you have available, or do we have collectively as a supply chain? How will we flex when we have less or more demand than we expect collectively? So that would be my approach. Too idealistic?
Yeah, it is. It does. Thank you. And quickly, in the interest of time, just a closing remark from both of you about how does one get on the journey of the multi-enterprise value networks that we've been talking about, and how far can one go with it?
That has to be one for Praveen. I've had all the other difficult ones.
I'm happy to short it, George. But look, I think like I was saying in my last slide as well, right? You have to figure out where to start. And the first start point is bringing your ecosystem together, bringing the data together. But don't try and start too big. Look for something big that's happening. Look for a D2C initiative that you might be driving, which becomes your anchor. Look for a certain market that you might be struggling with in right replenishment strategies. So look for a problem that is there, but look at it kind of bringing that whole ecosystem of demand signals and suppliers together, and then use that as a start point to drive interoperability of processes. Do not, I see a lot of people jumping to saying, hey, I've got to use this AI ML technique, and I've got this great platform that I've bought into and stuff like that. That's not really the point. The point is that you're really trying to drive process interoperability across your ecosystem of partners. Use machine learning and AI to help drive that. So don't be the hammer looking for a nail. Solve for some specific problems. Look for suggested orders. Look for better forecasts, and so on and so forth. So data at the heart, bringing that ecosystem together is the start point to my mind. Where can you go? Oh my God, there's so much value to be unlocked. There's miles to go. George.
Thank you for those insightful, it was quite an insightful discussion, and thank you for your valuable time, George and Praveen. I hand this back to Akinola, and thank you everyone that participated. Akinola, back to you, please.
Thank you very much, Gita, and thanks for facilitating that interesting session with Praveen and George. Thanks, George. Thanks, Praveen. And thanks to all our participants. We're just about 2 minutes over, and we'd like to close the meeting now. Please note that we will be happy to take this conversation forward offline. If you have any questions or any discussion, please feel free to reach out. We're able to connect you directly with the HVAC team to be able to help you and support you in any way. For that. Thank you everyone once again. It's been an interesting session, and we look forward to future opportunities to have you all. Bye everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gita.
Thank you.